There's never been a member of the royal family prosecuted for a crime. What would happen if they did? It can always get worse with Prince Andrew, can't it? At the very least, trafficking and sleeping with underage girls. For one of the reasons why it was settled was so...
He was keeping in contact even longer with Epstein than people realised.
Andrew is living this very strange life because his funding from his family has been cut off, and yet he's still able to maintain this multi-million-pound residence. How's he doing it?
There's secretive stuff going on, isn't there?
Look at Charles. He insisted on that meeting with Zelensky at Sandringham. It's a clear statement of intent. His mother never complained, never explained. Charles, you can put the dots together.
Does it show a sort of a favouritism towards Ukraine in the war?
Yes, because after the first half of With Love, Meghan came out, which was absolutely critically pilloried, but people in the left wing and the liberal media as well.
But she's failed at what she wanted most, to convince the public not only of her likeability, but of her great intellect.
We're looking at somebody who has ruthlessly monetised an image, who has ruthlessly taken her family, as you can see from her most recent show, and used those children as essentially props.
The last 2 months, you guys have really listened when I've asked you to subscribe. Thank you so much. Now, the next step is to ask you on YouTube to hit the reminder notification on my homepage. Without that, you'll miss out on my videos, and we wouldn't want that. Make sure as well that notifications are set as on YouTube or it won't work. If you're watching on Spotify, please hit follow. Alexander Larman, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Andrew.
We're going to be talking royals, we're going to be talking Prince Andrew and why he's been in the news again in particular, and we'll get on to some Meghan stuff. Will Prince Andrew be concerned about the Epstein List being in the news again?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. On the first hand, there's so much stuff about him that's already out there that, in a sense, we know the worst about him. We know that it's likely that those pictures of him in Central Park, they're so damaging, so devastating. How can it get any worse? And of course, what we've learned over the last few years is it can always get worse with Prince Andrew, can't it? Because what we're looking for now are more specific details. We're looking for not just flight records and stuff like that, but actually records of was he complicit in abuse that Epstein was doing? Was he actually somebody who was involved in criminal activity? Because what there's been this mark with Andrew is we're not sure as to whether Andrew has actually committed any crimes, because so far he hasn't been arrested, he hasn't been prosecuted, and the civil case, which was obviously highly embarrassing and led to his essentially departure from being a public member of the royal family, there was still no criminal case arising from that. And you can bet your bottom dollar for one of the reasons why it was settled was so nothing would be said in court would lead to any legal liability. But now there's another moment of danger. And so we'll have to see. But I mean, I'd be surprised if anything really damning was left to come out, but who knows?
The latest I'm hearing is that it's just that he was keeping in contact even longer with Epstein than people realised.
Oh, of course. And I'm sure that he stayed in contact with Epstein one way or another until Epstein died, or at least when Epstein went off to prison. But on the other hand, you think to yourself, but why wouldn't he? Because he's a stubborn character. He's never listened to anyone. He's never actually taken any note of anything anyone else is saying. So why would he have been any different in this regard? But that's the thing. You have to understand about Andrew, that he was the son of the late Queen. He could have been king if things had been slightly different. He has always gone through his entire life with a classic sense of noblesse oblige. He believes people are there to serve him and to service him when required. And therefore, the arrogance of being told, you must do this, no, I'm not going to do that. You can see that he wouldn't listen to anyone.
Is that why you think he may have been stubborn with regards to, I imagine people were telling him, don't do the Emily Maitlis documentary and make sure you don't say this and that, and he's just gone for it anyway, thinking he looked rather good?
Well, the trouble with Andrew is he's not very clever. But he thinks he's clever, or at least he thinks he's somebody who knows more about the media than he does. The Maitlis thing, I mean, it's coming up to its 6th year, unbelievably. Wow. And what we have to look at there is that he should never have done it. From a reputational perspective, there was no upside and it was all downside. But he believed, told by people around him, that it would clear his name and that he'd be able to go back to public favour. And you think, you haven't had public favour in such a long time. Because what's so interesting about him is we look back at the idea of Andrew, the Falklands pilot, Andrew, this gallant figure, because When he got divorced from Sarah Ferguson, he was the one who came out very well. She was the one who was having her toes sucked by financiers and things like that. And Andrew was seen as this steady, stoic presence. And I mean, if you go back even 10 years, Pitch at the Palace was seen as a successful thing. Andrew was the entrepreneurial one. He was the go-getting one. Because what we can now see is a Pitch at the Palace and Andrew's Air Miles Andy status. He was managing to make some very impressive, very high-level contacts, possibly in places that your governments or certainly the other members of the royal family would not go. And what we're now seeing is Andrew is living this very strange life because his funding from his family has been cut off, and yet he's still able to maintain this multi-million-pound residence and to have security costs and personal costs run into millions of pounds a year. How's he doing it? And of course, we don't know, because none of his finances are being made public, because, of course, the trade-off of not being a working royal anymore is that because he's retreated back into private life, he is no longer accountable. So we have this very strange thing, which I suppose we also have to extend with Harry. We have somebody who is nominally a member of the royal family with no responsibility. And you think, in a way, that must be quite nice, because you have all the perks in terms of the recognition and people wanting to give you money so you can fulfill their ambitions for you. But it's also quite contradictory, because you think to yourself, well, how does it all pan out? I mean, what are they going to do next?
That's interesting. I think that's what people have a problem with. If they do their duty and are very, willing to be part of this great symbol of our country and the Commonwealth and all of these things, people seem fine with the enormous wealth they are born into. But should they decide not to do any of that stuff and just, live a life of luxury and whatever, that's what, Harry and Meghan are finding out. Yeah. People aren't very happy. With Andrew, so the Chinese spy stuff, that sort of kicked off in the news again recently. Yeah. For someone who's never heard about any of that, what's a very basic explanation of what's gone on there?
Well, what you would say is that, well, there's actually two ways of looking at it. The first, the factual thing that we have is that Andrew was friends with somebody who was posing as a Chinese businessman, but was in fact a member of the Communist Party who'd essentially infiltrated Andrew's circle and was potentially feeding information back to the Chinese. But members of the royal family, members of the government were quite relaxed about it on the grounds that Andrew was too stupid to know what he was getting involved in. Okay. But secondly, he was never involved with he was never trusted because of his stupidity to be given any kind of information that would actually be of any damage to national security. So you would have an awful lot about Andrew's ambitions for his life and about what he wanted to do and about how he despised this member or that member of his family. But you wouldn't have anything that was of any use or any actual damage. But the Chinese spy thing, it's not over, because obviously we don't know the full extent of the contact that Andrew had. We know very limited amounts of it. I mean, you just think to yourself, it's dreadful, isn't it? Because if it's somebody who's a member of the government, you can vote them out. Member of the royal family, you can't vote them out. So even if they have disappeared from being a working royal, they're still there. Like the unpleasant, stain on the back of your shoe. You can't get rid of it.
Is this echoes of the concerns we've often had about the royals? Edward, was accused of working with the Nazis. Was that right?
Well, King Edward VIII, after he abdicated and became Duke of Windsor, it wasn't so much that he was a Nazi spy, but it was more that he had an audience with Hitler in 1937. But you can see it's the same principle. It's the same idea of arrogance, the same idea of not listening to anyone around you, and also the idea that the royal family has always been an unaccountable organisation. I mean, we don't have the strictures in place. I mean, I'll give you an example. I spent quite a lot of time over the last few years at the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle. And if you're a historian, you have to go through all of these hoops to be able to be allowed to go in there, but it's worth it when you do. But the only thing is that there's no catalogue, no publicly available catalogue of what's there. You have to send an email to the archivist saying what you want to look at, and then they will give you some files about it. But certain things, like for instance, the Duke of Kent died in a plane crash in 1942 in the middle of World War II. The circumstances are very mysterious. They're very, very uncertain. And I asked if I could see the files. Oh, we don't have any. None, not a single file about the death of a member of a royal family in active service. No, nothing. So you can see that we do not have full transparency. We don't have anything close to full transparency. And I know that my fellow author Andrew Lowney has, of course, been trying to get this transparency out there. But I can't see it happening anytime soon, because the royal family would say, well, we don't need to. We're not answerable to people who would be doing things like the Official Secrets Act or anything like that.
Yeah, Andrew was saying, and because it's not fresh in my memory, so tell me how that worked. I think it was he expected after a certain number of years, 70 odd, that certain files should be available, and they weren't.
Yes, I mean, you would expect that. But then on the other hand, I suppose what it's going to be is, for instance, I found another file, which is bizarrely at Balliol College in Oxford, which is about an assassination attempt on Edward VIII. Mm-hmm. And what transpired was the assassination attempt was either organised or at the very least tacitly permitted by MI5.
Wow.
Because they hated Edward VIII so much that if he could be got rid of by this man who was one of their informants, so be it. And of course, that would never, ever, ever have come into the public domain. But what so happened was the National Archives had some MI5 documents, and Balliol had this memoir written by the would-be assassin. You put them together, and you've got two sides of a jigsaw. So it's no coincidence that after my book came out, the MI5 documents were taken off again and have now been put back into cold storage. So if you want the story, you've got to read my book to find it out.
There's secretive stuff going on, isn't there? And it's interesting because I suppose the big tabloidy sensational story is Andrew and Epstein, which is, of course, a huge story. They are talking at the moment about the list coming out. That seems to happen every few months. This list is coming out and then it doesn't. It must be because of so-and-so's on the list. We have no idea. No one seems to know. But from talking to you and I suppose other royal biographers and things, it seems to be the real story, or at least a story of equal import, is what he was up to on all these trade goings on, and that's another thing. Andrew Loney wasn't able to get any access to those. That should all be public record, shouldn't it?
Of course it should, but the trouble is now is that because he has removed himself from the public domain and he's not getting any kind of public funding, he would argue that, again, this is the same as with Prince Harry, that although you are a member of the royal family, a public organisation, a public institution, you are a private citizen within that organisation. It's a very strange place to be because essentially you are saying, I'm going to use the circumstances of my birth, the circumstances of my background, to make contacts, to obtain financially advantageous situations for myself, and quite possibly to be able to be in a position that I'm committing illegal acts with no fear of retribution, because, there's never been a member of the royal family prosecuted for a crime. There's been minor things like the Princess Royal's dogs getting off a leash and biting people, but there's never been anything that would ever have resulted in a custodial sentence or anything like that. And you think, well, but what would happen if they did? I think that in the case of Andrew, there might very well have been crimes committed. At the very least, trafficking and sleeping with underage girls. Those are crimes. Those are crimes that should result in a prison sentence.
Do we know he did that?
We don't know he did that, but that seems to be the consensus. Well, I can't say it's a consensus until it's proved. But on the other hand, you would, if any of the stuff about Virginia Giuffre is true, and the fact that he settled out of court for a lot of money suggests that at the very least there might be no liability of guilt, but there's still a desire to want to make it go away, you have to ask, okay, well, if you're so certain about your innocence, why didn't you let the case go through? And the answer is almost certainly that something would have been said in court, either by him or somebody else, who would then have opened the doors to a criminal case. Now, of course, he might have been acquitted in court. He might have been seen as innocent, and might have been able to restore his reputation that way, but I doubt it.
And you'd imagine, because of how he's been so bullish in everything else, that if he really were innocent, and this is just my conjecture here, that he would have actually just fought that all the way.
Well, he wanted to.
Oh, right.
That's the thing. He wanted to go to court, and he was saying right up to the last minute, I want to clear my name, because I think he was essentially told, can you go to court and be certain of victory? If you can be 100% certain of victory, you should go to court. If you're 99% certain of victory, we have to settle the case out of court. And of course, it's impossible to say because there has never been a proper, scrutinous. There's never been a proper scrupulous scrutiny of the facts.
Scrupulous scrutiny.
Scrupulous scrutiny, yes.
Sounds like an album by the Streets or something. Everyone has a different opinion about the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, which is why I use my favourite news website, today's sponsor, Ground News, to get an idea of how the left and right reported the crazy meeting with Trump, Vance and Zelensky differently. It's fascinating to see that a lefty publication like Inquirer is concerned that the meeting left Ukraine exposed, whereas the right-leaning Daily Express had my former guest, Dr. Raj Persaud, writing about the 5 mistakes Zelensky made. Let me know in reply to my pinned comment which you agree with, and go to Ground News to see how this story has been reported across the spectrum with its really cool biased distribution, which shows in this case the media across the spectrum reported on the mad interaction. And check trustworthiness of each source with the factuality tool. Ground News is my only way to get unbiased news. Subscribe through ground.news/Andrew for 40% off unlimited access this month.
So you were saying to me before, I mean, off air, you were saying that this is going for Andrew. You think there's a lot to come, particularly with regards to finances and things. Yeah. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think that we don't know which countries he's been well. We have records of which countries he's been going to as an envoy. Of course, it's slightly shadowy. But if somebody could work out every single time he was on a private jet or something like that, I mean, just from records of which private, I mean, it must exist somewhere. It'd be hard and lengthy to put all this stuff together. But I would not be surprised to find out he's gone to some very, very dodgy places indeed, where there is a lot of money floating about, and money will be given to people, including members of the British royal family, if not too many questions are being asked about activities taking place in those countries. So is that going to come out? Well, everything else has come out so far, hasn't it? Why shouldn't this?
So it might well do. And it does appear that in that case, despite him being stupid, he is really a threat to national security.
Well, it depends how, because is he a threat to national security in that he's inadvertently given some very bad people access to the... But then, I mean, to what extent is the royal family these days bound up with national security? Because they have limited constitutional power. Although, on the other hand, we look at Charles and we look at the fact that he insisted on that meeting with Zelensky at Sandringham the other day, which was a clear statement of intent and a clear statement also of where his loyalties are in this ongoing fracas. So you think to yourself, it's very interesting because his mother, never complain, never explain. Charles, publicly, there's no complaining or explaining, but you can put the dots together and you can see, he's very much an interventionist king, much more so than I think he was initially supposed to be. So,
would he meet with Putin, Charles? Would he?
What do you mean? Well, is anyone going to meet with Putin? I mean, that's the question. Is Starmer going to meet with Putin? It's impossible to say at this stage. But I mean, we know Trump is, but Trump's dying to.
He is. Well, I just wonder if that meeting with Zelensky, does it show sort of a favouritism towards Ukraine in the war?
Yes, because it was held at Sandringham. It's very interesting because if you look at where royal meetings are held, if it had been his private home of Highgrove, that would have been tantamount to saying, "You are my personal friend." If you're having it at Buckingham Palace, means nothing. If you're having it at Sandringham, which is another private home, that is also it's a gesture and a statement.
Wow.
Balmoral is interesting because Balmoral for the late Queen was absolutely 100% her home, her private house. Charles doesn't like Balmoral. So it's interesting when he was offering Trump the chance to meet him there, that is not the mark of favour it initially appears. Because, I mean, Charles has opened Balmoral to the public. And you see, you don't do that unless you have a certain degree of contempt for it. But I think just to get all sort of Freudian and psychoanalytical about it, Charles's thing was when he went up to Gordonston for school, he was bullied within an inch of his life. He had a truly horrible time there. And you can see that has left a mark, that Scotland perhaps does not have fond memories for him that it did for his mother. And so Balmoral is less pressing for him. But also, I don't see him as a Scottish king. I see him as a Southern king. I see him as somebody who's essentially tied up. I mean, you can imagine, Highgrove is in Gloucestershire. It's a very expensive, fancy part of the world. Sandringham, North Norfolk, expensive, fancy part of the world. Charles is a man who looks for good things in life.
Do you think he is angling to influence Trump in some way?
He'd like to. Because you go back to the Tony Blair era, you go back to the Black Spider memos. Charles was writing all of his letters to politicians, especially around the secession of China the succession of Hong Kong from British rule to Chinese rule, Charles was very exercised about that. And I'm sure he didn't want it to happen. And of course, the fact that all these things came into the public domain must have been very embarrassing for him. But on the other hand, either you smile and wave and do nothing, which for an intelligent man is frustrating, or you try and use influence behind the scenes, but of course you are completely unelected. So it's quite dodgy, actually.
And we have this really strange situation where, I mean, firstly, I remember seeing a video Stephen Fry put out years ago that showed that countries that have a monarchy, an active monarchy, are happier. People are happier in those. Of course, it's self-reporting, so who knows? But I was talking to David Starkey yesterday. He came on, and obviously a controversial fella nowadays. Yeah. But he seemed to be suggesting, I don't want to put words in his mouth, that at least the monarchy is something that we can sort of hang our hat on as a unifying symbol. Do you find that?
Well, if there's somebody who knows about monarchy, it's Professor Starkey. I mean, he's a man who's been studying it and writing about it most of his life. You see, it's interesting because I'm not a monarchist. I'm not remotely a monarchist. And I think actually one of the reasons why I'm interested in writing about the monarchy as an institution is because I feel that it's a fundamentally backward and fundamentally retrograde idea. And I'd see it abolished tomorrow. But on the other hand, if you do abolish it, what are you replacing it with? You're replacing it with President Starmer. That's not a very appealing idea.
No, it's not.
So the question is, what I'd quite like to see in this country is for monarchy become more like somewhere like Amsterdam, where there is, that they cycle around on their bicycles every day. They're not actually having any kind of power. There's not vast amounts of money given to them. There's no civil list or anything like that. They are essentially private citizens who are able to lead private lives. I think that would be, I mean, you look at Prince William, a man who obviously does not want to become king. And you think, well, why does he have to be? Apart from the fact that he was born at a certain time in a certain position. And you think to yourself, who is going to stand up and say, I don't want this anymore? Because when Edward VIII abdicated, he had a younger brother in the form of George VI, who was dutiful, terrible stammer. But apart from that, he was able to go off and actually do the job far better than Edward ever did. But in the case of William, well, if he decides he didn't want to do it, well, Harry's not going to come back and do it, is he?
Maybe he would. Because if things have gone so badly for them, and I think we'll speak a bit more about them later on, but it's gone so badly for Harry and Meghan, to come back and then he's king and she's queen, as much as the public don't want that, might be the only move left to them if William didn't want it.
But I think William would be, he'd have to be dead in his entire family. But of course, even if he was dead and his entire family, I mean, that'd be the most awful thing in the world. But I'm sure there would be somewhere in the line of succession, they'd find somebody else somewhere rather than it being King Harry and Queen Meghan.
Doesn't it have to go to Harry if it's not William?
Well, it should do. But of course, what you're hoping is that William's got 3 children. Thinking, well, it'd be quite unprecedented. The line of succession would go to
there's them first, then Harry.
But of course, they're all massively underage. So you would have a bizarre situation that you would have, King George, but while he was still a minor, you'd probably have Harry as some kind of, or somebody like that. It's a very bizarre idea, isn't it?
Could be a disaster. I think what Starkey was saying is, we're in an issue right now with immigration in particular, where we just have so many different kinds of people from different cultures and different backgrounds all come into this one place. We're feeling more and more like an airport. Yeah. We don't know what our idea. If you say what is Englishness, what is Britishness, and they're 2 different things, and I'm coming to learn from angry commenters who tell me that, but of course they are. Yeah. I don't even know, freedom of some sort. So I don't even. But the pomp and ceremony of a monarchy seems to be something to keep, especially as Christianity wanes. It's something.
It's interesting because I remember watching the coronation a few years ago, and I found it ridiculous. I found Penny Mordaunt with her sword one of the silliest things I'd ever seen on television. And I had to go on Al Jazeera that day and talk about it. And I just said, what a load of rubbish. This is absolute nonsense. We're not a serious grown-up country if we're still doing things like this. Then I realised I was completely out of kilter with what everyone else was saying because I was watching it at home. I wasn't in some sort of coronation viewing party or anything like that. And I was just reacting to it as I saw it, but essentially because I love the music, I love the idea of the historical precedence of it, but I just thought it's this very strange compromise between the old-fashioned coronation and trying to bring in elements of the Commonwealth and wokery and things like that. I just thought, and Penny Mordaunt with the sword, it just seemed to me the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen. That you get this woman frowning and bearing a ceremonial sword for the entire ceremony.
I think I would have to not do it if I was, not that I'd ever be asked to do any of those things, because it's quite, I find it silly. At the same time, with a lot of people are saying with Christianity on the wane, and I'm an atheist, I'm not into any of that, but what's replacing it is the wokery and sometimes perhaps even another religion in the form of Islamism, which is scary. And people say it's because of the lack of Christianity. Now, I would say, and I think what Starkey was saying is it's not necessarily Christianity, but it's pomp and ceremony. It's something to have. So I think maybe we're starting to realise how important that symbol of the royal family is.
Well, you need some sort of symbol, don't you? And of course, what we've had in this country is we've had football, we've had celebrity, we've had lots of things that people try and cling to. And of course, football's something which I don't follow it myself, but I can see the appeal of it because it's about having a tribe and about having something that you support and a sense of loyalty and also a sense of sticking to something through thick or thin. Because if you look at politics in this country, I mean, most people I know are not tribal anymore. You're not tribally Labour, you're not tribally Conservative. And so there's a sense now that, I mean, I speak for myself here, that whoever comes in at the next election offers me something closest to what I believe is going to get my vote. So I suppose the thing about monarchy is that, in the words of Shakespeare, it should be an ever-fixed mark. It should be something which we look at and we think there's something to aspire to. But on the other hand, since the late Queen died, there has not been an awful lot to aspire to, has there? Because the reason why the royal family not only flourished under her, but actually became the defining symbol of the country of this period, was because she was the longest serving ruler in this country. She completely understood what people wanted from majesty. I mean, in her own words, she had to be seen to be believed. And that, I think, redefined what monarchy was, because you take her father, who was a good wartime king, but a lousy peacetime king. You take her uncle, Edward VIII, who dreadful king on every conceivable level, and you go back and you just see this deeply unimpressive selection of people until you come to Victoria, the other great ruler, and somebody else who believed in duty. And of course, that's the thing. It is a compact with the British people, one that Elizabeth II explicitly made on her 21st birthday when she said, all my life should be devoted to your service, whether it be long or short. I can't imagine Charles saying that, because it isn't the same impulse there. It's a different, more contradictory impulse, because Charles is, he's an intelligent man. I mean, it's something that's quite easy to forget about him. He is an intelligent, cultured and thoughtful man who I think would probably question the basis on which monarchy exists, but also he wants to be able to do what he likes.
I wonder if, I was thinking then, obviously the two that you mentioned as positives in Elizabeth and Victoria are women.
Yes.
That's just, that's unavoidable. I noticed that. Is there something, maybe women are better leaders in that respect, or a very controversial thing to say, are they better at being, and I don't mean in the 1960s, but are they better at being a dutiful leader rather than one who wants to put their own mark, as Prince Andrew, King Charles would want to do?
I think it's fair to say I'd much rather see the Princess of Wales become Queen than I'd like to see the Prince of Wales become King, because she is somebody who has dealt with an awful lot of things over the last few years. Yes.
Kate or Catherine. Everyone gets angry when I say Kate.
I know, strange. I always have to refer to her as Catherine whenever I write about her now, which seems unnatural because she will always be Kate Middleton.
Apparently she prefers Catherine.
Really?
But that was just someone told me that in a chat on YouTube, so I don't know.
The one thing I wonder is, because I knew people who were at school with her, and I mean, I can't imagine they're likely to run into her just, in the Kensington Waitrose these days. But if you did, I mean, what would it be like? Would you expect to curtsy to her? Would you expect to say, Your Royal Highness? I mean, that's the funny thing. But if you knew somebody in this, if you like, incognito previous existence, do you have to, I mean, I suppose publicly you probably do, don't you? I mean, I suppose if you're to be lucky enough to be invited to the private house, you can probably go back into the old regime. But if you happen to be a nodding acquaintance of somebody who ran into them again, we're best just not to speak to them, I would have thought.
Very strange. It's a really interesting point. I mean, I think, and I'm sure you as a public figure as well, you're a public figure now, and you weren't when you were a child, I imagine. And so people do react differently to you as well.
Yeah.
And because I talk about such controversial things around gender and Islam and things, I wonder if they want to sort of look the other way and pretend they haven't seen me now. So that's a bit of a strange one. But if you become part of the royals, well, I wonder to what extent Meghan in the States, did her American Hollywood friends start curtsying to her?
Well, it's interesting with Meghan because obviously she has gone through a journey, shall we say, because if you go back a few years, she was a likeable, quite perky actress who appeared in Suits, but she wasn't an A-list actress by any stretch of imagination. She would, I'd say, middle of the B-list. And if she hadn't met Prince Harry in London, then I don't know, maybe she'd have gone on to appear in a few more shows like Suits, but I don't think we'd be talking about her now. In fact, that she has become one of the most famous women in the world owes itself to two factors. First of all, of course, the marriage to Harry and the subsequent elevation and then the departure from the royal family. But secondly, it's the way that she has basically stage managed everything. And I don't look at Harry as a man who's stage managing stuff. I look at him as a man who's basically making it up as he goes along. I was looking at her, and there is a plan. There was a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and so on. And I would strongly recommend that none of your listeners or viewers watch her Instagram account because it is absolutely nauseating. But what's very interesting is everything about it is very carefully done. There is not a hair out of place. There isn't a little cheeky look at camera which hasn't been carefully choreographed beforehand. And of course, she's an actress, and good actresses, and she clearly is a good actress, are adept at presenting this facade of friendliness and accessibility. But underneath it, you're looking at the coldest CEO imaginable. You were looking at somebody who was ruthlessly monetized an image, who was ruthlessly taken her family, as you can see from her most recent show, and used those children as essentially props. And you think to yourself, you've got to admire it, because it's very easy to sneer at her, to make sexist, racist, xenophobic comments. But you think to yourself, no, why would you do that? That's just stupid. What you do instead is you look at her, the same way you might look at a man like, say, Rupert Murdoch, and think, play what they're doing, criticise them not for their personality, but criticise them for what they've actually said and done.
I wonder if the counter argument would be, though, yes, she's obviously very famous now, has all the money she can ever need, although they have these lavish lifestyles that, who knows how long that will even last. But she's failed at what she wanted most, which was, I think, to convince the public not only of her likability, but of her great intellect. And I understand what you're saying. As a businesswoman, she's obviously succeeded in many respects. But every time she's tried to do anything for Netflix, Spotify, any of these things that doesn't involve digging out the royals, because that's all anyone really wants from her, it's completely flopped and failed critically and the popular vote.
But what's interesting is, as I found to my cost, she has these absolutely rabid fans, and they call themselves the Sussex Squad.
Yes.
And I've been trying to work out who these people are, because I assumed initially they were bots. I genuinely assumed they were some sort of computer program that has infiltrated social media, but they're not. What I think it is a kind of weird ragtag coalition of people who genuinely love her and genuinely think that she is the best thing ever. And these people think that because she is a woman and a woman of colour, that anyone criticising her is racist and is misogynistic. That's the first supporter she's got. The second sort of supporter she's got, those who just want to fight. They're the kind of people who see what's going on and I think would equally have gone in against her as well. And the third category is simply people who think that she's wonderful and that she is somebody who should be praised and that she is somebody who has something to offer, and that people like me who publicly criticised her are jealous. And you see this, and it's fascinating because these people, I've noticed, are very, very nasty pieces of work, a lot of them. But on the other hand, from my perspective, I dish it out, I have to take it. So
you've had some encounters with those guys, the Sussex Squad. But again, with the internet, you can never really get a good idea, a good grasp of how large that is. There's always going to be someone as famous as Meghan, even if there are just a few hundred mad fans, obsessive fans, that feels like a lot on Twitter when they're all having a go. So, in the sort of popularity, in the UK and the US, she seems to always be down. And it looks like Netflix have, it's like they've signed this long contract. So they just keep having to put out this stuff. And they throw it all out at once, didn't they, that series? Rather than every week, one of Meghan's episodes. It didn't feel like they had confidence in it, did it?
Well, what they did is they commissioned 2 seasons at the same time, which meant they were filmed at the same time as well. So this rather strange thing that after the first half of With Love, Meghan came out, which was absolutely critically pilloried, not just by people like me, who can be accused of having an axe to grind, but people in the left wing of the liberal media as well. I mean, The Guardian, Marina Hyde in The Guardian was actually one of the harshest people about it. What I would say to my dear chums in the Sussex squad is, why don't you go after Marina Hyde? Why don't you go after...
Well, I'm sure they will.
I'm sure they do. But I mean, I suspect that Marina Hyde's attitude towards it is much like my attitude towards it, that at the end of the day, these keyboard warriors are people that you can't take seriously, because if you had a genuine case to make for the Duchess of Sussex, make it publicly. Go and write articles about it, write books about her, because Omid Scobie wrote that book, Finding Freedom, which was enormously successful. And I think that was the high watermark of the Harry and Meghan campaign, because I think there genuinely was a sense, after their quasi-abdication, after the Oprah show, I mean, do you remember that Piers Morgan was essentially fired for saying that she was a liar after she went on Oprah Winfrey?
Gosh.
And that now seems incredible, because that was when, generally speaking, the tide of public opinion was with her, that she was felt to have been this wronged figure. And then the royal family fought back with that brilliant line about recollections may vary, which apparently was Kate Middleton's line.
Yeah.
So that shows that there's a very savvy brain there as well.
That's interesting. Gosh, it feels like so this is it. There's one side of it that's this entrepreneurial, smart side that she has. And the other side, it's like you couldn't have gotten it more wrong if you tried, because she started off by, I think she wanted to show she had this intellect, she had this ability to interview people. Yeah. She was incapable of interviewing people because she was too much of a narcissist, I think. Had to bring herself into it. She put herself on par with Serena Williams and people like that, and said, oh, people like us. And it's like, well, hang on. You married someone. Yeah. Serena Williams is one of the greats in her particular field of all time, is the great of all time. Amazing. She couldn't laugh when Mariah Carey said that she's a diva. She said Mariah was saying she's a diva herself, and so is Meghan. And Meghan couldn't laugh along, no sense of humour, so she couldn't do that. And she's ended up 10 years on, or however many years, going back to what she could, had she embraced the role as in the royal family, she's basically become a trad wife, which she could have done from the start with the royals and made her own marmalade and jam and things.
But it's interesting also that she was being offered all these things, like, I mean, it's a relatively minor thing, but the National Theatre made her their patron. So what she could have done from within the royal family is had a huge amount of influence and a huge amount of sway, because what's interesting is she is obviously left-wing, woke, very socially conscious. Now, there's nobody else in the royal family who particularly is. So she obviously would have said, this is awful, I'm chafing against the bonds. But a more adept woman would have said, well, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this initiative and I'm going to take this. Because you see, you take somebody like Princess of Wales, I have no idea what her personal politics are. It's impossible to say. But what she's doing, most of her campaigns, and the same thing with the Queen, who I don't think anyone would be confusing with a woke or a left-wing person, is that what they are doing, the kind of campaigns they are doing, I'm sure Meghan would have done the same. And you think to yourself, if you hadn't quit the royal family, if you hadn't left all this behind, you'd be in a far better position because you could have influenced from within.
See, I think she's not even really woke. I'm guessing here, but it just seems that was the vehicle she was using at that moment. It was popular then.
Yeah. But I suppose the question I'd ask about wokery is that given that I think the tide turned about a year ago and that now it's on its way out, for people who were once unquestioningly signed up to all the tenets of woke are now saying things like, actually, I don't believe all this stuff really.
Ash Sarkar
being the most obvious example.
Catherine Ryan.
Stephen Fry recently.
Well, he was always saying that. He's sort of flip-flopped. No one really knew. But he always said that was sort of Obama did as well. There were always some of these sort of liberal people who said woke is nonsense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Obama was very sound about it. And actually, that's one thing we should always give him credit for. But he was always saying, you think you're a big man because you're on your keyboard and stuff like that. So that was always something he was very sound about. Because the thing about wokery was it had this period of being like a kind of religion. It was something that people signed up to. But the trouble is, it's like a religion where you don't know who the God is and you don't know who the disciples are. And you don't actually know what the aim is, except be kind. You think, so be kind or be vicious to us as you can to anyone who doesn't agree with you. I mean, I don't know what's replaced it, because, I mean, it's sort of individualism, every man for himself, let's be horrible to whoever we can. I don't know, because the only argument for woke is that if it's about decency and tolerance, and of course we should embrace that. Sure. But I'm not sure that, because actually this is the thing. I mean, I get a lot of criticism because I am always accused of saying Princess of Wales is wonderful and Meghan is awful. And I've had to say several times, well, actually, I think the thing about Princess of Wales is in some respects she's a throwback because she is, almost Stepford wife-ish in terms of how she's brought out to smile and wave. And you can't help thinking that in the 21st century, she is not a representative of modern femininity. She's somebody who essentially exists to be at her husband's side. But you can also see that the royal establishment, after Diana and after Meghan, they had to have somebody who was pliable, who was going to go out there and wasn't going to cause difficulty. So from that perspective, she is the perfect 21st century.
They're also in a bit of a bind, the royals, I think, because there's a lot of talk all the time about abolishing the monarchy. And they have tried at times to appeal to that kind of progressive side, but the progressive side are never going to embrace a monarchy. So Meghan, I think in particular, she burnt both bridges there because she was getting at least, you talked, was it Marina Hyde, the Guardian kinds of people, but they're not going to enjoy her Tradwife series. So she's gone full circle and she's now just doing this conservative stuff that she could have done right from the beginning. And she could have said, hey, I'm Meghan Markle, I like making all the jam and putting posh pretzels in a different bag.
Or Meghan Sussex, as she calls herself in the show.
What was that about?
I don't know, really. I mean, it seems just one of those things chucked out there. You're thinking, okay, that's interesting.
It's maybe a rebrand. I think a rebrand from Meghan Markle, the woke, whatever, to now I'm this sort of conservative royalist character.
Yeah, I mean, conservative with a small c, because clearly there is that ongoing disagreement with Donald Trump, and that's manifests itself in very amusing ways. I mean, it's hilarious, because the thing about Trump is that I could talk about him all day. We're not here to talk about Trump. But he's a vaudevillian. He's an old school stand-up comedian who chucks outrageous statements out. But I'm saying, no, I'm not going to throw out Harry from my country. He's got enough trouble with his wife. And you think to yourself, that's such a sexist thing to say, but it's also very funny because of the way it's done. And of course, they fought back and talked about the forces of oppression and so forth. But you just think to yourself...
Yeah. Have you seen Trump with the Seinfeld background music?
Not yet.
There's something he did about straws. He was talking about straws. The straws. We're not allowed a straw. You can't have a plastic straw. All of that. But they had the dum 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 dum. So he's like up there on the stage doing that, and it's brilliant. It would have been a perfect Seinfeld routine. He absolutely nailed every second of that. So he could. You're right. He could have been a '90s comedian or some such thing. So the Meghan series, as you say, it's been panned. Yeah. But she's been sort of showing off that it's still in the sort of it's number 5. In Netflix's top watch shows.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, there's quite a large part of me that would probably never like to speak or write about her ever again because I feel that I have nothing more to say. I have nothing fresh to say that I'm not saying to you or that I haven't written about before because she's not going to change as a character. I mean, as you say, there's been this movement away from wokery towards tradwifedom, but it's not much of a journey, is it? I mean, nothing much has really changed. And I think to myself, the trouble for people like me, people like you, people like any writer, we're giving her the oxygen of publicity. And because of that, which is why Netflix are paying huge amounts of money, as if she's allowed to disappear quietly out of the public domain. Because I also know, sometimes I feel sorry for her. I genuinely feel it must be absolutely appalling to have that level of abuse, that level of... Because, of course, you're isolated from it in a sense in your $18 million house in Montecito, but you're not isolated from it because you are in a cage. You can't lead anything like a normal life because you know that you have to spend all this money on security because if you didn't, somebody would try and kill you. And that's the terrifying thing. There are these people out there who would do harm to her and do harm to her family because they've got themselves so whipped up into a frenzy of hatred. And you have to take a step back and you think, why do you hate somebody? It goes both ways, but I don't think that her most ardent defenders are going to try and kill people. So I can imagine her most ardent detractors probably would. And at that point, you actually think, well, you've lost any kind of perspective on what we're talking about here. Just because you don't like somebody, public eye, you don't have to hurt them.
You would hope that nobody would ever be hurt, but threaten them violently or anything like that. But there are nutters out there, aren't there?
And I mean, the death threats, you go on social media and you see there are endless death threats. And you just think, but that must be hideous.
No, that's absurd and ridiculous. If anyone watching this is thinking of doing that, please do not do it. I think the issue is it's on the one hand, it's this sort of tabloidy, silly story that doesn't matter to anyone. On the other hand, if you do see the monarchy as this unifying symbol for this nation to put its hat on, she's gone in and single-handedly done it more damage, perhaps, than anybody in 100 years.
Well, Diana. I mean, Diana was very interesting because we could get into the circumstances of Diana's death. It's probably best we don't.
Why is that? Do you think there's a conspiracy?
No comment.
Really?
No comment. It's one of those things. I have absolutely not one shred of proof, not one shred of inside information. So it would not be something I would ever talk about publicly. But all I would say is Diana's death in 1997 brought a very abrupt end to the greatest existential problem that the royal family had since Edward VIII. But it was very different because Edward VIII was a rotten piece of work. He was a Nazi sympathiser, he was spoilt, he was selfish, he was just a really abhorrent human being. It was Diana. Okay, personally, she might have had eccentricities and she might have had problems and so forth, but she was utterly beloved, a decent, kind, compassionate and sympathetic person who made the rest of the royal family look utterly anachronistic. And you think to yourself, had she lived, there is no way in God's green earth that Charles would be able to marry Camilla. He'd probably never been able to have an open relationship. He would never have been able to have not flaunted, that's too strong, but she would have made sure that she would have been operating a kind of, if you like, a power base in exile. And how would that have been with a future king? Because she would still be a relatively young woman had she lived. I mean, she'd still be only in her 60s. You think to yourself, it's extraordinary, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Sad. I suppose the other side of that is, yes, but you've made a martyr of her. Had they done it deliberately, she was even more beloved afterwards.
She was, but of course but nobody really blamed the royal family. And of course, the trouble with any conspiracy theory is that you end up in Mohammed al-Fayed territory. You end up with Prince Philip organised it all. And you think, well, that's ridiculous because, I mean, one thing I'll just say in passing, Prince Philip might be the most misunderstood member of the royal family who ever existed because a civilised, cultured, very intelligent man who had a reputation as being this splenetic old racist. And actually, you go back to his private letters, especially written around the time that he was courting Princess Elizabeth, and you see somebody of remarkable wit, remarkable sophistication. But that wasn't the image that was wanted for him, so he had to become this sort of bluff colonel type.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he was clearly a smart person.
Yeah.
I suppose it almost feels like there was something earlier you said about what is replacing the wokery that's died in the last year. I keep remarking upon this great article I read by Thomas Chatterton Williams, which was that we're entering the stage of vice signalling. Virtue signalling is gone. Yeah. Vice signalling now, and that's what you've seen in America with the Sig Heiling. Yeah. They're not actually suggesting they're Nazis. They're just going, look how naughty we can be. Yeah. As an overreaction to the virtue signalling.
It's very difficult because you look at vice signalling and it's pathetic.
Because
it isn't saying anything. It's like Steve Bannon doing a Nazi salute on stage. It isn't making a point.
It's identity politics, the same as the left.
Yes, but it's a kind of, it's the child saying, I'm going to use a naughty word. I'm going to do something that I shouldn't do. We don't really have a British equivalent of it yet, do we? Because we haven't got it in the form of any of the major political parties. We have someone like Tommy Robinson, but of course he's seen as completely different because he's seen as somebody who is a freedom fighter who's been wrongly imprisoned. And you think, it's not quite like that, but never mind. But I suppose that, we are going to go the way of America eventually in this regard because you look at what's happened with Trump, you look at what's happened with the election, and you think, well, it's strange because in this country, we still have a sort of Biden-esque figure as our leader. We have somebody who is trying desperately to get the centre to hold. It's not going to hold because ultimately the vice signalling is too seductive, isn't it? It's that Shakespeare wrote, the devil hath a power to assume a pleasing shape. Well, a pleasing shape that we see now is the way in which you can say or do what you like with no repercussions. And on the one hand, that is superficially attractive. It is superficially a sense of free speech. But you think, but what is free speech? Is free speech the ability to express your opinions without fear of being put in prison for them? Or is free speech the ability to abuse people and to issue death threats and so forth without any kind of repercussions for that? I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? You can't have one size fits all.
Yeah, that's true. I think as it moves, if you're a true heretic, to use the name of the show, or if you're just somebody who's just anti-establishment or anti-whatever, and there are a lot of individuals like that. I'd like to think you and I are like that. I'd like to think that most viewers of this show are. Yeah. But you will then resist the lurch to the right, just as you resisted the lurch to the left, the authoritarian left, authoritarian right. You don't want to be told by anyone. I don't want to be in Steve Bannon's group. No. I don't want to be in his Sig Heiling group. No. I don't want to be on the left's, the Meghan Markle's group. No. I don't want any of their groups. And you have to put your pronouns. You have to do or on the right, you've got to do your sign to show that you don't care. We should resist all of the authoritarians.
Well, I think that's one of the things about why I've never been a fan of a monarchy, is that in a sense you're being told what to think about an organisation or an institution.
Sure.
And you have to be able to reject these things. You have to be able to say, well, no, I don't believe this. I don't believe that if I saw Catherine Middleton in the Waitrose in Kensington, that I must bow to her. But I think, why should I? I mean, why should I bow to her husband for that matter? Why should I bow to King Charles? In fact, what was funny is I once met the Prince of Wales many years ago at a literary event, and I had one too many glasses of champagne. And I went up to him and talked to him about poetry because I thought that's what you should do. And it's quite interesting because he himself was very approachable and accessible. You could just see the bodyguards thinking, how's this gone, man?
And they've got fake hands. Have you seen them?
What?
The bodyguards, I don't know, again, it sounds like conspiracy videos or whatever, but apparently it's quite common among bodyguards.
Right.
The hands, he was holding something, his security guards or bodyguards, and the hands did not move for like 5 minutes of walking around, stayed exactly the same position because they're actually, their arms are inside holding a gun or whatever.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
So be careful next time you read in poetry. But go on, sorry. What were
talking about Charles and hands. I mean, obviously, he jokes about his sausage fingers.
Oh, God. Sounds like Keir Starmer bring back the sausages. So what happened when you met him with the poetry?
It was invented at the Royal Academy. It's 2006. And I just went up to him and said, so I understand that you're a great fan of John Betjeman. Yes. But don't you think he's like, Philip Larkin, but less good? Yes, I suppose you could say that, yes. And that's pretty much the end of our conversation. Because, of course, you don't go in for any of this, introducing yourself, shaking hands or anything like that. Because that's a strange thing about meeting the ultra famous. It's that they don't care who you are. You know everything about them already.
Yeah.
So you are talking to them essentially almost on an equal playing field, as long as you're not talking about them, talking about some third topic.
He might just be like, I can't talk about Larkin again. The last 5 people came up to me, asked me about Betjeman and Larkin. Done with that. Let friendly bombs fall and shut up. I am done with this. I don't know. Tell me a little bit. Oh, you know what? Before I get on to that, could Trump potentially kick Harry out? I know they've sort of talked about that. Is that going to happen?
I don't see why he would. I mean, I don't see what benefit it is to him to do that. I mean, it's that... But who knows? I mean, Trump seems very happy to kick a lot of people out of the country.
Yeah.
So.
Or if they don't have their papers, and if their papers are a bit dodgy, and that's what the presumptions are about Harry and his papers, especially a bit about the lies around drug taking.
Yeah. But then that's difficult, isn't it? Because I never thought Nigella Lawson had a lot of trouble getting into America after she made a confession of taking cocaine with her late husband.
Huh.
So it does happen. I mean, because I went to America a couple of times last year, and you have to declare everything that you've done. I mean, you have to declare if you were, cautioned for nicking a bar of chocolate 30 years ago. I mean, it's incredibly strict. So
that was a bad moment in your life, wasn't it? The chocolate.
That nicking. 10p chomp's come back to haunt me many times since.
The Freddo or whatever it's called.
Done for by a Freddo. But no, I mean, I can't actually see it happening. I can't actually see Harry being thrown out of the country. I mean, whether he might leave the country voluntarily, that's another issue. But where would he go? Because you're not going to come back to Britain, not in these circumstances. No. Go to New Zealand, somewhere like that.
Could the two of them just disappear into irrelevance? Is that what Wallis Simpson and Edward did in the end?
Well, yes and no. I mean, they went off to sort of France and they spent the last 30 years of their lives essentially rootless and stateless. But they were still celebrities. I mean, don't forget, they both wrote best-selling autobiographies. There were still people who had that kind of fame and that kind of reputation. But they weren't relevant. And that's a question for Harry and Meghan. I mean, to what extent are they relevant? Because do they have any kind of sway? Do they have any kind of power? You see, had Kamala Harris become president, I have no doubt whatsoever that you would have seen Harry and Meghan trying to take up a more central position in American public life. Because a few years ago, I read an article for Spectator World, for Spectator's American magazine, which I posited the idea that Meghan might herself have had a crack at the White House. Now, that seems absolutely ridiculous. But back then, I spoke to quite a few well-placed people saying, this is her path, this is her run. Because you think to yourself, in the event, as has just happened, of a severe Democrat defeat, who's going to run next time. And the thing is, you're not going to put up the same person. And there's not a lot to choose between Meghan and Kamala, is there?
No. I thought that might happen as well. And I thought they'd be cozying up if Kamala had gotten in. I definitely saw that happening. And they must have been gutted when Trump got in.
Absolutely.
Well, tell me a bit about your work. Is there a particular book you want to send people to?
Well, it's interesting because I started off my career not as a royal correspondent, not as a royal historian, but I started writing about people like Lord Rochester and Lord Byron, the decadent poets. And I pivoted away, partly because books weren't selling, let's be quite honest about it, but also because...
Byron not as sexy as he was.
Well, no, but what was interesting is I very much came out against Byron because writing that book, I realised he was essentially abused all these women in his life. And I just found it so depressing that this figure who we see as this dashing, almost heroic figure was actually a piece of shit. So that was quite... But then what was interesting is I still remember addressing the Byron Society that year when it came out. And the Lord Byron stood up and he'd announced me from the floor as writing a liberal, anachronistic book. I was like, it's the first time I've been called liberal publicly as an insult in my life.
Bastards.
But that was interesting because after that, I was thinking about doing something that was more contemporary from the 17th or 19th centuries. And what occurred to me, and actually Andrew Loney, who used to be my literary agent, was the abdication crisis, because it hadn't been done very well or very interestingly. And I thought to myself, there is material here that people haven't really looked at, but also coming at it from a perspective that I was quite open-minded about it. I wasn't taking the traditional Edward evil, George VI great approach. It was slightly more nuanced than that. And then obviously you do a book like that and you're privileged enough to go to Windsor Castle and see the Royal Archives. And then you think to yourself, well, surely there's other stuff as well. So the second book, what became a trilogy, The Windsors at War, followed the royal family from 36, the immediate aftermath of the abdication to the end of World War II. Then the last book in the trilogy, Power and Glory, essentially started in 45 with VE Day and ended with Elizabeth's coronation. So you've got, what I feel really privileged to have done is to have written nearly 250,000 words about this 19-year period, focusing on this fascinating character of the Duke of Windsor. So I feel deeply, deeply proud to have done that. And I'm very pleased with the books. But of course, people often ask me, would you write about the contemporary royal family? And I say, well, I've written about them a lot in my journalism, but would I ever do a book about it? I just don't know, because I've had ideas. But I've always think that, could I write a book about Harry and Meghan? Well, I could. But what would I say? Because writing a book about something that you are instinctively negative about gets very boring, because you've got to sit at your desk every day and you've got to actually engage yourself enough to want to carry on writing. And if all you're doing is writing something which is hate-filled propaganda, by the time you've written 1,000 words or so, you get sick of it. So what you would then have to do is to try far harder to actually find a positive case for Harry, a positive case for Meghan. And I think in Harry's case, it isn't too hard to find a positive case for him. He's clearly a man who loves his family. He's a man who clearly is deeply interested in Invictus. And I think that you would struggle to see Harry as a malign figure. You would struggle to see him as somebody who is, he gets angry, certainly. He has the Windsor temper. But
arrogance. Well.
Having read and indeed listened to his autobiography, I know it's all ghost-written and it's utterly bizarre in places, but you do not get a sense of a nasty or unpleasant character. And then Meghan, I think the case I'd make for her is that she has suffered this enormous adversity. She has been treated appallingly by these figures I'd say mainly on the right, but not exclusively, who would, I say, putting her under huge amounts of personal pressure. That if she's achieved anything in these circumstances has to be seen as impressive. So that is, if you will, the case for the Sussexes.
That's the case for a book about them and a nuanced look, I suppose.
It would have to be, because I think otherwise you'd just be so tiresome. And actually, that's why the Obed Scobie books don't work, because they portray the rest of the royal family as evil and wicked. And Harry and Meghan is this wonderful, saintly couple. You think, well, no, it doesn't work like that.
That's not human beings, really.
No.
With Harry, when I read his book, Spare, I just got... What it was more than anything, there was a scene when he was in the bathroom in Eton and his friends had been smoking marijuana or something like that. But he was upset for whatever reason. He looked out the window and he was thinking, gosh, you guys out there, you don't know how lucky you are compared to me. And it's like, this was like, outside of Eton, you go a bit outside, you're talking about Slough and, these are not, but speaking of John Betjeman, so this is not, this is something that I find it remarkable that he hadn't, and maybe that's just being a royal. You don't learn about how people really live.
No, but then I suppose the question is for him, it's would you rather be somebody of the same age who'd be living in a council estate in Slough, but without the crushing responsibilities, or would you rather be somebody who has huge amounts of money, huge amounts of privilege, but also is one of the most scrutinised people in the world? Because it's funny, isn't it? Because yes, I mean, to an extent, a very limited extent, I'm a public figure, but the downside is when people start abusing me on social media, because you start to think to yourself, it's tiresome. It isn't so much upsetting as boring. But then, is there an upside of being a public figure? Well, not really. I mean, it's...
But imagine being the public figure you are, but with Harry's money. That changes it.
There's not many people like that.
Then you're on holiday in who knows where, and then there's no one coming up to you then or anything. So I think that's the difference. And you're right. I wouldn't wish Harry's life on the on most people, but there still needs to be an awareness. There are people struggling to put food on the table, and that's when it's like, come on, Hazza.
Yeah. No, but I think that is true, and I think that ultimately. But when you are in this very isolated situation, you start to forget what ordinary life's like. You forget about how difficult it can be for people.
That's true. We'll put the links below so people can get your wonderful books. I hope people do. And I'm sure they will, actually, because there's a huge interest among my followers for sort of biographies and looking behind the curtain of the
behind
royals.
The masks.
Yes. Who's a heretic you admire?
Well, this is an interesting one because it's actually Winston Churchill, who is nobody's usual idea of a heretic. But I've been thinking a lot lately about the issue of appeasement and the issue of whether, if you're faced with these adversaries who apparently can't be beaten, you have to appease them. And of course, we're talking a lot at the moment about Trump and Zelensky and Putin and at the moment, it does seem as if a policy of appeasement has essentially been taken by everybody in both Europe and America, that Putin will carry on fighting this war unless he is bought off. And you think to yourself, well, what Churchill, when faced with exactly the same situation with Hitler in the 1930s, refused to accept was that Hitler couldn't be defeated. So he made himself very unpopular by continuing to say, we should not be trying to appease Hitler. We should be fighting Hitler. We should be preparing our country for a state of war. And of course, you look at all these other people like Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain, all the rest of them around him. They are all saying, we've just been through the war to end all wars. We cannot fight again. We must essentially give Hitler what he wants. And Churchill had the courage and the conviction to say, no, we can't. It is better to fight another war than it would be to let this monster of depravity take over Europe. And of course, he was spectacularly vindicated. And what I feel is that whenever people talk about Churchill as this representation of arch conservatism, the old Edwardian and so forth, you think, have you ever bothered to see what he said? Have you ever bothered to look at the way that he made himself enormously unpopular before he was Prime Minister by sticking to these views and never giving them up? There was never any question that he was going to take on a policy of appeasement. And of course, for his own political career, it would have been much better for him. Because we often forget that Churchill was not Prime Minister in the 30s. He'd had this political career. He'd been Lord of the Admiralty. He'd been Chancellor. But he was washed up, and he wasn't a young man by then. And he had this heretical belief we should not seek terms with Hitler, and he stuck to it. And I will always find that incredibly inspirational, actually, the sense that you have a principle you've arrived at. Everybody around you is telling you you have to sacrifice this principle. And you say, no, I won't.
He's certainly a true heretic in that sense. And you're right, there's been a movement in the sort of anti-woke sphere. I think, again, it's an overreaction because the woke people who had all the Black Lives Matter in their thing, they also had the Ukraine flags. So it makes sense that sort of the anti-woke side are going like, well, no, that means this Russia guy must be all right, actually. And you got Tucker Carlson, you see when he was running around Russia going, look at this, you can get such cheap food here. What a wonderful... So yeah, because people can't afford to live, they have much lower incomes and things. So it's a really complex situation, Ukraine and Russia, not one I know all that much about.
No, I mean, you will have people defending Putin, and more people are defending Putin than there were. And I mean, I would say, admittedly, if not from a perspective of knowing everything about it, I think I wouldn't hurry to do that. I really would not be rushing in to defend Vladimir Putin.
The accusations that are being sort of thrown at Zelensky and Ukraine about Ukraine and the issues it has could all be also thrown at Russia. So it's difficult.
Yes.
Again, I only mentioned him because he was here yesterday, David Starkey.
Yeah.
He seemed to see it as really complicated because he was saying, I mean, there's so much more to it than I can even got, but he was saying, look, you got to remember Ukraine is this fairly new part that's trying to break away from Russia in some respects.
Yeah.
It gets very complicated. So I won't go too far into that, except to say that was a great heretic, Winston Churchill. And people, please go and get Alexander's brilliant books. They are going to be linked down below. He's come all this way. He's come in and he's given up his time, and it's been absolutely brilliant. So please get that, get reading, hit the like here, and keep watching this channel.